back, everyone. It's good to have you here. So right now I am out in the woods doing some forest photography, but I figured it would be a good time to make a video showing you how I set up all my camera settings. So these aren't the specific exposure settings like f-stop, ISO, shutter speed, and all that stuff. These are the underlying camera settings that determine the entire functionality of the camera. Most of us don't really need all these buttons and all these settings. So what I do is I set up my camera to be very simple, just to do the specific things that I need, and then I can control everything just using one hand for exposure. All the underlying settings as far as metering and what the camera does, we'll cover in this video. So if you're shooting with a Nikon D810, you can just exactly copy what I have. I'm sure some of the other Nikon cameras are very similar, but if you're not, I've also included a PDF guide that has like a little write out of each of the different settings, so you can take some time in Google and with your camera, and you can go through and get each one of these dialed in. So at first you're probably looking at all the settings. If you have a new camera, you're thinking, man, this stuff's really boring. But I urge you guys to take the time, maybe it'll take an hour to 3 hours, to really go through all the settings on your camera and match them to what I have on the PDF document. And I think you'll get really good results, because what I found happening when I first started in photography was that I would push a button and I wouldn't know why the button was doing the specific thing. And often it was doing that because it was controlled by some underlying setting. By becoming a master of your tool, the camera, it'll be a lot easier for you to take exposures and get good images out in the field. But it's going to take that 1 to 3 hours initial startup time to sit down and be like, this is boring, but I need to understand what's going on. So I urge you guys to do that. That's your homework. You can check out the PDFs in this video and get started from there. So I'm just going to show you the back of my camera screen here, and then you can copy this. And if you don't have a Nikon D810, watching this video still might be very helpful, because there might be some aha or light bulb moments you see with the settings, even though they won't be the exact same buttons as my camera. So I'll just go through these one at a time, and you can also check out that PDF as well. So on my Nikon I have this menu button, and I'm just going to start at the top menu, which is the play menu, and go through all of them. And a lot of you are going to have these same settings on your camera. Some might have different settings depending on your brand, make, and model, but I think you'll be able to use Google and tease them out using this video in the PDF document. So the first thing is just the playback folder. I'm just going to skip the ones that I have not changed. So the first thing I have here is playback display options. Now these are the options that you see on review after you actually take the image. So once I take an image, these playback display options determine what I'll actually see. So I have this set up. I don't show my focus point after I'm done. And then additional photo info. I want to see if there's blown out highlights, and I want to see my RGB histogram. I don't care about the shooting data. So that keeps me very minimal. After I take the shot, I have the RGB highlight blinkies, which will blink on the screen if I'm blown out. And then after that, my other option is the histograms, and you can see when I cycle through that, it's very simple. So that's playback display. I don't touch copy images. Image review, I have that turned to off. After I take the image on the camera, I don't want it popping the image up on the back of the screen, because often I don't want to see every single image, and that just kind of inhibits me from taking shot after shot and really getting in the zone of shooting. So I turn that off, but if I want to see the image, I can push a button. So a key thing whenever you're doing anything for setting up camera buttons overall, I like to have every single button do one specific thing, and that's it. Because if a button does more than one specific thing, such as all these buttons all over the camera, then I'm always guessing at what the actual button's going to do. So by going through here and optimizing each button so it only does one thing, when I push that button, I know the exact result I'm going to get. And I think that's one of the troubles with cameras, is that it tries to guess what people want. So for landscape photography, you don't want the camera to be guessing at all. You want to have every button do a precise thing, and that's it. So as far as this goes, after delete, I don't care. Then I have rotate tall off. Now that just means that if I had a vertical picture, it would rotate it tall when in horizontal. I don't like that because I want to see my vertical pictures vertical when my camera's stood up like that. So I have rotate tall off. Slideshow, I don't use that. So the next thing I have here is shooting menu. And you can see these menu names up here. So I have extended menu banks off. Storage folder, these are all nominal. File naming is just my initials. Then we have primary slot and secondary slot. So on this camera, I have a CF card, which is the big card, and then I have an SD card slot. My goal is to have the camera take the images to the CF card because it's a faster write speed. So it will take those images. Now while it's taking those images, there's a buffer in the camera that will write them to that SD card. So the goal there is, at the end of the day, I have 2 different cards with the exact same images on them, but the cards, generally, you want them to go to the fastest write speed first. So primary slot, that's the one you want for the fastest write speed. So CF card. If both of your cards are SDs, just put the primary as SD. Secondary slot function. I want to back up from the primary. So that looks good. I definitely don't want to overflow or JPEG. So that's just going to make a 1-to-1 duplicate copy for me. Image quality. Next one. I'm going to go to RAW. I don't shoot any other files. So a lot of people will shoot a JPEG and a RAW. I just want the RAW files. Takes up the least memory card space and it writes to the memory card the fastest. Next is JPEG TIFF recording. I don't touch that because I don't shoot in JPEG or TIFF. This is NEF. NEF is a Nikon RAW file. So this is just the raw image recording. If I click on that, I want the image size being the biggest size or largest size RAW file. Compression turned off completely. Don't compress your files. And bit depth at your highest depth. So often I'll hear people say, well, I'm going to compress the file down and I'm going to use a lower bit depth because it'll take up less space on my memory card. Well, there's no point of buying a really nice full frame camera or a new model digital camera if you're going to throw away half of the information off the picture once it takes it. So if you compress them down, you might as well have a lesser quality camera. So just keep them uncompressed and that'll keep the image quality a lot better overall. So the next thing we'll go to is image area. I just have mine on FX, that is Nikon's full frame format. You can also use crop factors with this camera, but I don't ever use them. And I don't want auto crop. I don't want auto anything. White balance, I just have it K or Kelvin mode, which I'll show you how to use in the shooting videos. Picture control. Now this is very important. You have all these different picture controls. So when you're taking a RAW file, your camera's actually going to display a JPEG rendering of that RAW file on the back of your screen here. Now you want the JPEG to look as close as possible to the actual RAW file that you shot, which will give you a good representation of the RAW file histogram. Now, the histogram on the back of the screen is also JPEG. So I want to select the JPEG file rendering, which is the flattest with the least contrast or the most neutral. So the JPEG histogram on the back of the camera will be as close as possible to the RAW file histogram that I'm actually taking. So when I'm looking at these, different cameras will have different settings, but you have standard, neutral, vivid, monochrome, portrait. I use flat. Neutral works very well too. If you're not sure for yours, just take a picture with each one. So just select one, fire the picture off, look at the back of your screen with the same composition, and then whatever one has the lowest contrast is the one you'll want. So you want the least vivid with the lowest contrast. That allows the JPEG that you see on the back of your screen to match as closely as possible to the RAW file that's actually on the memory card. Birds cruising around. Picture control, I don't touch that. Color space, this doesn't matter, but you can put it on Adobe RGB. This only matters for JPEG or TIFF. Active delighting, I don't touch. Vignette control, I just have mine on normal. And like I said before, some cameras may or might not have this stuff. This is just for people that might have it. Auto distortion control off. Long exposure noise reduction and high ISO noise reduction. So both high ISO and long exposure noise reduction are not applied to the RAW file. They're applied by the camera through an algorithm to the JPEG file after the RAW file is captured. So if you're just shooting in RAW, you're just wasting battery by using those, because all you're going to see is you're going to see those applied to the back of your camera screen, but you didn't actually capture them as a JPEG. So when you get home as the RAW file, you won't see any of those long ISO or the noise reductions applied. So just leave both of those off, you'll save battery. So I have both of those turned off. ISO sensitivity, I just control ISO on the top of my camera, so I'll show you in a little bit. All these multiple exposures off, intervals off, time lapses off, movie settings are off. So the next thing we'll go to is the custom settings bank. Now these are all the actual shooting settings. They control how you interact with the camera. So autofocus, I have AFC priority on release. So I see a lot of people do this. They'll push their shutter button and it won't take the image, and they'll be like, why not? It's because the autofocus is on focus, not release. So if the camera autofocus thinks you don't have the perfect focus, it won't let you take the image. So you want to optimize this so it's on release only, and then it'll take it whenever you hit the shutter button. So leave that on release. AFS priority, that is on release as well. Focus tracking with lock on, I have that off. AF activation is off. Now this is a big one. You can watch my back button focus guide. I want it on AF on only. This keeps my camera from trying to focus when I push the shutter button, but you guys will learn that in the next videos and how that works. But I just have AF activation to off. Focus point display, I don't leave that on. I don't want to see where my focus points are because I use a single point spot focus. And if some of these words or phrases don't make sense, upon watching the following videos in the series, they'll make more sense to you. Focus point illumination, don't care about it. Focus point wraparound, I do care. So what focus point wraparound means, if you're trying to focus here and you move your focus box off one edge, it'll come on to the other edge. So it's a lot easier than moving it from this side all the way back to that side. So I leave that on. And you can see for Nikons, you can see the letters here, so you guys can copy them if you want. Number of focus points, I want that at maximum. That's for autofocus, but I don't use it a lot, but sometimes I do. Store by orientation, that just means the focus point's orientation will stay image to image. Built-in AF assister, off. Limit AF area mode selection, autofocus mode restrictions, off. So the next menu is ISO sensitivity step. I have this at 1/3. This is just the stops on the camera. You can see these are in 1/3. So each big tick mark is one stop. Each small one is a third. You could also make those a half or anything else, but I like the best control, so I go with a third. EV steps, that's the same thing. I go with a third of a stop. Flash exposure comp, I don't use that ever, but it's at a third as well. Easy exposure compensation, off. Matrix metering. Face detection, off. Now this is not the matrix metering mode setting. We'll cover metering modes here in a moment, but that's for face detection. I have that off. As far as metering goes, I'm using center weighted average metering. So if you look at the composition, it just meters the center of this, and in the following videos you'll see why that's so important. But I like to have this on center weighted average and average. These are all diameters you could go with. That means they'll meter closer and closer into the center of the composition. I like to use it on average, or the widest center weighted average I can get. Fine-tuned optimal exposure, I don't use that. Shutter release button, AE, I don't ever use that button. Shutter release button, AEL, that's just auto exposure lock, I don't ever use it. The methods I use to shoot, you'll see later, it doesn't require it. Standby timer is 1 minute, that means it just shuts the screen off after a minute. Self timer, this is just for taking shots. If you want to take a shot and then run and get in it, this is a good way to do it, but I don't need that here. Monitor off delay. So this will just turn all the playback and everything off. Menus, 10 seconds. You can also move all those around. They will just help you to save battery. Live view is an important one to have the lowest. So if you forget to touch your camera, those will control everything for you. So we'll go down to beep. This is a big one. So I've walked into busy parking lots in national parks just traveling to get to trailheads, and I've just heard beep, 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 and it's just coming from all over the place. So when we're out in nature and we're in a wilderness landscape or even a park, by turning the beeps off on the cameras, it just makes everybody else's experience a lot better. Everybody's trying to escape the sound and the noise, but unfortunately camera manufacturers leave the beeps on nominally. So just turn all your beeps off, have silent out here, because it's just nice to be out here in the quiet, and it's more respectful to others as well. So I always turn all the beeps off. CL mode, this is just continuous shooting. If you shoot wildlife, you can have it up top. I just leave it up top in case I need it. Max continuous release, that means I can take 100 images continuously. Don't know why I'd want to. Exposure delay mode, this is a cool one. So on this camera I have mirror up mode, and if I go to that exposure delay mode, I put it on 3 seconds. So to get the least amount of shake, I'm shooting and I have it on mirror up. Usually mirror up, you push the button once and you can hear the mirror go up. If you push it twice, see how it waited 3 seconds? So it's a combination of a quick delay timer with mirror up mode, and that gives you the best overall image sharpness. So that's just called exposure delay. Electronic front shutter curtain off, file number sequence on, viewfinder grid display, that's just the grid in this actual viewfinder, it's not the back here. ISO display and adjustment, I have that off. Screen tips off, information display, manual, I don't want a bunch of information popping up on different settings. LCD illumination off. Battery type, I just have the standard bottom battery. Battery order doesn't matter because I only have one single battery. Flash stuff, I don't use any flash ever, so don't need to touch that. No flash, no flash. No bracketing, I don't do any auto bracketing. I do all the bracketing, as I'll show you guys, manually, just using exposure compensation. Then I know the exact exposure for the shot I want. Back down here, so we have multi-select your center button. So that's this button right here. When I'm shooting, it just pulls the focus point back to the center if I'm in the viewfinder with the eye. But my favorite function of this is that when I'm on live view, like I am right now, if I move my single point spot focus box around, and I'll show you all about this in the following videos. Let's say I move it over here, and then I focus right there. Well, I can't get a good idea if I'm focused this far out, so I have that center button set to zoom at 100%. So now I can use the autofocus and really see if I'm focused or not. So that's what that button is. It's just called multi-select your center button, but you could set any button on the back of your camera to do the same thing. So in live view, you can see I have it on zoom on and then magnification 100. I found that it became too grainy at magnification 200, but 100 works very well. Then I have playback mode. For the center button, I have it on histograms. So after I take the image, if I hold that center button, I can see the RGB histogram for this JPEG rendering on the back. So this histogram is why it's so important to have that neutral or flat color set, as I talked about in the earlier parts of this video. So that was playback mode, and I just set my playback mode to view histograms. Now we'll go back to the next button down. Assign FN button. I don't ever use that. That is the button right up here on the front of the camera. Some people like to have a function on that. I don't ever find I need one, but if you had to, you can put it up there. Assign preview button. That's the other button on the front of the camera, which I never use. Assign AE FL button. I don't ever use that. Shutter speed and aperture lock, don't touch it. Assign bracket button. I don't touch that either. Customize command dials. So these are just the rotation of your dials, depending on if you like your rotation to go clockwise or counterclockwise for positive or negative on shutter speed, aperture, and all that stuff. I just have them set at nominal, but that's big time personal preference. Release button to dial, use dial, off. Slot empty release lock, never use it. Reverse indicators. These are just your exposure compensation indicators, however I'd like to display it on the camera. That's all personal preference as well. Movie record button. Okay, so this is a big one. So on the top of my camera, I have the shutter button, and then I have the exposure compensation button, and then I have this red movie record button. Since I don't use it for movies while I'm shooting, I have my ISO on that. And then on this back button here, I can just use the combination of all of these to control my aperture, my f-stop, and my ISO. So when I'm shooting, one hand controls all of the different exposure settings. That gives me a free hand to hold the camera and adjust it or dial in where it should actually be using the ball head here. So by having all those exposure settings on one hand just makes everything right here really easy to do and less complicated. So I like to have the movie button right here, and a lot of cameras have custom settings like this. I just have it for my ISO. Live view button options on. I have that on enable. Assign, I don't know what that button is, never used it. That's F15 setting. Assign remote WR function. Lens functions buttons, I don't use those. And then assign FN button. I haven't assigned any of these. And then the shutter button, the last one, just takes photos. So if you're going to set up any settings on your camera, doing that stuff determines how you actually control the camera and what kind of images it takes. So that's more important than anything else. A lot of cameras will have less options than this. Some cameras probably have more, but the goal is to go through each option and determine if you need it or not. A lot of those you can see that I had on there I didn't use. So I probably only used 5% of the things my camera could do, but I know how to do those 5% of things extremely well, and I know where the settings are. So I'm always in control of the camera, and I know exactly what's coming out of it when I'm out here setting up the scene. So the next thing we'll look at is back over to this menu, and this is the setup menu on the Nikon. So that's the format memory card, monitor brightness. I put this at 0. If I'm on a really long backpacking trip, I'll put it even lower, down in this -3 area, because it helps to save battery. But for this video, I wanted you guys to be able to see easily, so I put it at 0. But usually I'll drop that even lower, because it doesn't matter how dark that is, you're looking at your histogram to check the image brightness, so that doesn't really matter. Monitor color balance, I don't care. Clean image sensor, you can just push this on some cameras and it'll flap the shutter up and down and slightly clean the center off. Flicker reduction, I don't even know what that is, but I have it on auto. Time zone and date, you guys can handle that. Language, auto image rotation on. So that just means when my camera's in vertical, that the image will be vertical and I can easily look at it. I just never want to be looking at the back of the screen and having to turn my head sideways to see what's going on. Battery info, don't care, never touched it. Image comment, I don't need any of that. Virtual horizon. Now a lot of cameras have this built into live view, which I use all the time. You can see this composition I have is not perfectly level right now, but that's okay, because I'm just teaching you guys the settings. So that's what that is. AF fine tune, I don't ever fine tune these lenses. I shoot with a Nikkor 14-24, and it's really sharp out of the box, so I'm not going to mess with that stuff. You could if you wanted, if you want that last 1% optimization. Location data, I don't use location data. And firmware version, that's just how you can upgrade your firmware on the internal parts of your camera. So my menu, this is just where I have things that I want quick access to. The only thing I have on there, exposure delay mode and self timer. So that's how I have that set up. So those are the basics of the underlying ways that your camera will operate when you push specific buttons. So obviously this is a Nikon D810, so if you have that camera, it's super easy for you to copy. But if you don't, like I said, do the homework and make sure that you control this camera and you're not wondering why different buttons are doing different things. But as far as my setup goes and other settings, I shoot in aperture priority mode for all landscapes. The only time I shoot in manual is for night sky stuff, or when enough light can't get in the scene for the camera to meter it accurately. And we'll cover that in the following videos. As far as my setup for live view, I like to have my info button, and that just cycles through from grid to histogram to level, and then off so I can actually see the composition. And then as far as settings for exposure goes, the only settings I have up here for exposure is I control my f-stop with this little front button. I control the actual image brightness. You can see right here if I pull the histogram up. Exposure compensation right here allows me to control the image brightness down or up. And then as I had stated before, my ISO is on that movie button right there. And then my shutter speed is just controlled by image brightness since I'm shooting aperture priority mode. And in the following videos, you'll see and I'll explain why this is optimal and why manual mode is actually really hard to use. And maybe I shouldn't say hard. Manual mode requires the same amount of understanding as aperture priority mode, but it requires a lot more input as the light changes during the shoot. So I prefer aperture priority. It actually has just as much control, but the camera meters the amount of light for you. So it allows you to dial in and optimize the perfect exposure. But that's for the next videos. So as far as everything else goes, that's how I have it set up. Now over here, I do sometimes control white balance. So the WB button right here does white balance. And if you don't have it on a button or heads up, put the white balance button somewhere you can easily access it on your camera. So not buried in the menus, but put it on some button on the outside of your camera. And that allows me to control the Kelvin white balance, which you'll see in the following videos. I also have an ISO button here, which I never use because I control it over here. And then I have, that's just a metering button, and I don't touch those. All the time, except when I'm shooting handheld, I shoot in mirror up mode. And mirror up mode, like I said, just reduces the vibration from the mirror shake inside the front of DSLR cameras. I'm guessing for mirrorless that doesn't exist, but having a 3-second or a 5-second delay on the shutter button before it takes the image is good for any tripod landscape shots because it just dampens out the shake from when you push the camera, so it's not shaking when the actual image takes. Alright, so let's take a quick look at autofocus settings. So on my camera, I have the autofocus settings up here, and I just have that on AF on, meaning the autofocus is always on, and it's always on my lens. Now, if I want to use manual focus, I can just turn my lens because, as you'll remember earlier, I took the autofocus off of my shutter button, so it's only on this bat button, but that'll be covered in the back button focus. So the essential or key settings here for your autofocus is I use this AFS. That means AF single. It's just this small little box, and depending on where I want to focus in the scene, I just move that box there, and then I can use my back button here, and it'll focus there. Now, I can change the size of this box. There's a smaller one. Let me see if I can hold the camera and do this at the same time. So, on the back, just watch it. There's this one, and then there's that one. I use the widest one possible. And you want it to be the most minimal that you can see something inside the box. I found that smaller one, I couldn't see stuff inside the box very well. But wherever I put this on my screen, I can just hold this center selector button down and it'll zoom in there at 100%. And that allows me to scroll around wherever I want with that little focus box. So that's going to be great for having the most control over your autofocus. The thing you don't want for landscape photography is to push the autofocus button and the camera just reads the scene and dials in what focus it thinks you want, but it never really knows what you want. So I prefer that little box, and I select the hyperfocal distance, which we'll discuss in the future, and then from that I get the perfect sharp focus every time. But just don't let your camera take control of all the autofocus settings. Make sure it's dialed in so you actually determine exactly where you're going to focus within the scene, and you'll have a lot better sharp images over time. So as far as camera setting goes, that covers everything that I use for my camera setup. But like I said before, it will be boring. It will take some research and some Googling for your camera make and model, but use the PDF, use this video, and spend a few hours and get everything dialed in for your camera. And it's also going to help to take some practice images, maybe come outside and do it, so you can see how your camera's reacting to the new settings and get used to them before you go out and shoot, because it might have a little learning curve, but in the end, you won't always be pushing buttons and be like, oh, why doesn't this button do the thing I want? The last thing I want to say again is make sure every button on your camera on the outside of it that's not buried in a menu has one specific function, and that's it. You don't want to be pushing a button and hoping the camera guesses the correct outcome. You want to push a button and know the exact outcome that you're going to get from that button. So a few tips to help you out. Hopefully you guys found this video helpful. Make sure to study up, do your research for your camera, get everything dialed in, and then move on to the next videos where I'll show you all the different shooting techniques. Thanks for being here, guys. I appreciate it. See you in the next video.